be truly happy. The great introductions like these are typically followed by a disclaimer, except in my case, the disclaimer and the modesty behind it are real. The only reason I'm here today is because I was told that if you have a daring idea to test out, and especially if it involves inequality, the place to go is Berkeley, because people are going to be open-minded, interested in hearing anything, and just willing to listen to whatever. It doesn't mean that you're not going to get pointed questions, but at least it gives you a chance to explore that idea in great depth. And so I was discussing with Magali, we happened to be discussing, can't remember, 4 or 5 months ago. And then she just said, well, we have a seminar. And I said, yeah, well, I'm going to come here and test this idea. And so the ideas that I want to test out, these are ideas that I've been mulling over with colleagues of mine that I've been working with for some time. And so the ideas are not really ours, but it's sort of a montage of 2 ideas that I would consider relatively daring. One of the ideas, if we can get this to roll. Is it on?
It should be on.
Works at all? No? Seems like something's not engaged.
Right, okay. Okay, perfect. You have to click here. Now, if you had, if someday you are interested in being laughed out of a room and being taken not seriously, try something like saying that the world is flat. I think you're going to definitely get some attention. But that's exactly what Tom Friedman did about 20 years ago when he argued that the world was not flat in a geographic sense, but it actually flattening, that the world was converging. Countries across the world were becoming closer and closer in terms of their the economic gaps. But what he was arguing is that this sort of convergence was really had nothing to do with demography, it had to do with globalization, forces of globalization and technology. And so that's the first idea that I want to jump from. The second idea is precisely to argue that demography matters. It matters a great deal. And the idea here is from Todd Emanuel, who was writing sort of a summary of how he saw demography affecting this century. And in his view, demography was going to be a very influential factor in this century. Now, I, at the time, considered this idea daring, but I think I'm not alone. There are a few people who actually think that demography is going to make a great deal of impact on societies over the coming change. The difference is what different people mean exactly by demography, what facet of demography they consider to be influential, whether it's going to be immigration, fertility transition, global population size, et cetera, et cetera. Another difference is going to be the exact social change that they expect to see, whether it has to do with the environment, it has to do with inequality, politics, whether it has to do with race relationships, and so forth. In my case, I sort of focus my argument on these 2 aspects that are here in red. I'm interested in the effect of global fertility transition and how I see them affecting inequality between countries over time. And I'm arguing that you're going to have what I call the great convergence, a version of Tom Friedman's idea, but with a greater emphasis on the role of demography. Right? And so essentially what I'm saying is that as we stand today, let's say in the year 2020, we are in the midst of a century of demographic convergence in which sort of the North and the South are gradually coming together in a demographic sense. So there's a demographic convergence coming together of global North and global South. And that convergence is going to lead to an economic convergence. So essentially, demographic convergence leading to economic convergence. That's the same, sort of the basic idea. And I, just to make sure, and I think this idea has not been fully tested, it has been relatively untested. And yet I believe it can be tested, or at least explored, with methods that are relatively simple. Robert and I talked last night a great deal about trying demographic innovation, trying to break through the usual method and innovate at the margin if you have to solve problems that are not addressed with existing method. And essentially, that's what I try to do here. And just to give you the short story at the end, what I find to test my idea of demographic convergence leading to economic convergence is that, yes, when you look at the changes that are happening, first of all, let me clarify that what I see as my century, people define these century differently. But the century that I focus on is the century from 1970 to 2070. That's my century, the century that I focus attention on. And so what I find is that indeed, if you look at how the North and South are coming together economically, you don't have a tremendous overhaul so far. Things, you don't have a revolution. Things are not changing all the way altogether, but there's really a clear economic convergence. And some of that convergence is driven by demographic processes. And the leading demographic processes is not sort of changes in the relative size of countries' population, but in age structure. So essentially, it's a macro level, it's a global level version of research on demographic dividends that most of you are accustomed to hearing about. Okay, so that's the landing point. There is an economic convergence that is fueled in part by demographic convergence, and that invites us to pay attention to changes in age structure and fertility transitions in the global South, because they're going to have global ramifications. So that's the end of this, the landing story. I'm going to now go and roll out the idea, starting with basically what I mean by global demographic convergence. Essentially, this is the global equivalent of demographic transition. Demographic transition, how individual countries move from high birth rate to low birth rate. Same idea, except you take it to a global scale. And instead of looking at the average fertility level of individual countries, you look at fertility inequality between the global North and the global South and how they change over time. That's the same idea, essentially, except the scale changes, the time frame changes, and the metric changes. And so what I see, if you want to describe this in the same manner as you would describe sort of global demographic transition with this curve here, the curve of the global demographic convergence looks like a more or less of a bell-shaped curve. Initially, you have all countries that have high fertility, and then the global North takes off, reduces its birth rate, yields benefit from, begins to reduce birth rate, and so the gap in birth rate increases and reaches a peak until at which point some of the countries in the global South start reducing their fertility as well. And so the gap begins to narrow. And so this occurs in two waves. The first wave is, Latin America and Asia as the first wave of countries to reduce their birth rate, and then sort of Africa follows later. Okay, so European fertility transition, first wave of global South, second wave of global South in terms of reducing the birth rate. And so that's what gives that shape. So that's the stylized version, just to give you the real data to show that they conform to this visual here, and that I didn't pull the 1970 to 2070 out of thin air. This is data showing patterns of fertility transitions across the world. Here in red, you have not really global North. You don't have the US and Australia and its offshoots and Canada. And the pattern is going to be sort of better if you look at all these countries. But nonetheless, in the 70s, you have the first wave of countries in the global South that initiate their fertility transition. And then they completed here. You can see here around 2020. And then you move forward, and Africa is supposed to complete it here. So the time frame that I chose is really consistent with the patterns of fertility that we observe, and is consistent with the visual that I described. Sorry, the visual that I showed here before, right? Except this is based on real data as opposed to just simplified form. So this is the notion of economic convergence. Now, the second leg of my argument is that not only do you have a demographic convergence, but it's going to lead to an economic convergence. And why would that be the case? Again, for this audience, that's not really something that we would explain. It has to do with the demographic dividend. And so the argument is a simple byproduct of the argument of the demographic dividend. The notion that as countries move in their fertility transition, you have this shift, this change, from fertility, high fertility to low fertility. And in terms of age structure, from high age dependency to low age dependency to high again as populations age. And the window of time here when you have low age dependency is a time that is conducive to saving, greater saving and investment. A lot of people here at Berkeley have worked on this. I pioneered these questions, so I don't need to spend time here on this. And so essentially, I take from this demographic dividend story and I transport it to a higher scale. So just as the demographic transition at the level of individual countries provides a window of time for national economic growth, if you think about this on a global scale and remembering that sort of countries in the global south are now catching up, right? What this would mean is that at the global scale, you have today a window of opportunity for a global convergence as these countries catch up demographically. If they reap economic dividend, that is going to bring them closer economically to countries in the global north. And that's what is going to drive the convergence in economics. So essentially, demographic convergence begets economic convergence. Just by sheer logic, if the idea of demographic dividend is to be taken seriously.
Could you say a word about how you're thinking of parents' investments in their children, human capital in this kind of, I mean, here you're just talking about age structure composition,
Right.
but behind all of this, there's another story. Is that, am I jumping ahead or?
No, it's a good point. What I'm looking at here is just sort of the mechanical side of the demographic dividend. The other piece, my own thinking about demographic dividends is that you have first, the first dividend, which is sort of this mechanical effect of age structure, maybe the second dividend, which is about sort of aging, and the second, and then a third, which has to do with human capital investment. There may be, so demographic change affects a number of behavioral changes that have to do with greater investment in schooling, that have to do with greater participation of women in the labor force, that actually amplify the effect of demographic change. And so from my perspective, I look at this as sort of the minimal effect. So the mechanical minimum baseline effect of demographic change. And so this is the story, and I think it's an important idea both scientifically as well as practically. Scientifically, I think it kind of adds to existing debates on population and development. In the case of this debate, you have had a sort of a switch from a macro focus where there's been interest in the relationship between population growth and economic growth, and then involved, post-Carroll into a greater focus on micro level outcomes. So from macro to micro, and then again, here folks at Berkeley as well as Harvard have brought attention to the meso level, where it's no longer just a very macro or very micro, but a meso level focus where you look at age structure. And in my case, you also look at something that is distributional, not just average growth, but really the distribution of resources. So this is the contribution here to the debate. Have the middle layer of that debate be addressed. It also contributes to the debates on global inequality. There's been a lot of work here, especially looking at the effect of at the roots of change in global inequality between countries. As I said before, there's a fair amount of work. There's the Friedman work arguing that the world is becoming flat. It's a classic study that I have really learned a lot from and jumped off from by Fireball and Gosling that has really depicted trends in global inequality between countries and tried to account for the factors driving this. Again, both set of studies give a relatively narrow role to demography. when demography is considered, there's really only attention to population size, not age structure, if it's considered at all. What I'm arguing instead is that we ought to consider age structure as well, and that's what I try to do. So it's an important idea scientifically, but it's also an important idea practically. And again, that's where Berkeley comes in for everybody who's interested in questions of inequality. And if you worry about global inequality, there are two pieces of global inequality. That's the inequality that exists between countries and the inequality within countries. And so as you look at these two pieces and how they change over time, what I'm arguing, if the claim that I make here is correct, is that increasingly, much of the global inequality is going to be driven by inequality within countries as opposed to between countries. And so that has a lot of implications in terms of policy. That's the first thing. The second thing is the notion of demostratification, arguing that demography matters a great deal, not just marginally, matters a great deal for the levels of inequality. And then the final piece, which answers your question, Josh, about where the Africa piece comes in, is that I see Africa increasingly becoming the epicenter, the global epicenter of inequality. Already, if you look at inequality within countries, Africa now has sort of a large number of countries that are in the top tier of countries that have the highest level of inequality in the world. If you take the top 20, I believe close to 11 are from Africa. So in terms of inequality within countries, Africa is already a key player in the negative. And that trend is likely to continue. The pattern that you see now in most demographic transitions in Africa is that they run from the top to the bottom. The fertility declines begins among the upper economic groups before it trickles down. And what that is likely to do is really exacerbate inequality within countries. So I expect inequality within African countries to grow, and for Africa to stay and even become a greater piece of the story when we want to observe inequality within countries. Now, if you add to this that in terms of between country inequality, because Africa is the last wave, the last country to join the fertility transition, what is going to happen between 2020, at least now, and 2070 is going to be driven by trends in Africa. What happens in Africa is going to be determining, it's going to be central to the big story of inequality between countries, right? So whether you look at within or between, Africa is going to be really the big story to pay attention to, right? If you want to understand global inequality. So these are reasons why I think this idea is important. Now, it's been relatively under-tested. And I would just think about, I don't have the references here, but I think it's fair to say that past studies that have tried to document dividends, that is to say how much fertility transition or transformation in age structure lead to economic growth, have tended to focus on individual countries, one country at a time. And many of these countries have been very, very detailed. The methods have been data hungry in ways that make it difficult to carry this analysis for a wide range of countries, let alone on a global scale, right? And that's been the limitation. If you look at past studies of drivers of global inequality, this is the critique on the limitation that I just talked about. There's been a greater tendency to look away from demography as a source of change in inequality between countries. Here is sort of this study of Firebaugh and Gosling, which I also sort of try to replicate. I just try to redo what they've done with the similar data. And both their study and ours reanalysis suggests that if the only demographic factor that you consider is population size, relative population size, you get the impression that population plays a very marginal role. Out of all of the change in between countries of inequality, only 2% can be accounted for by changes in the relative size of countries. Did India become a relatively larger or smaller? Did the US become a relatively smaller? And so what I'm arguing is that population size is not the factor to pay attention to. You have to also consider changes in age structure. Otherwise, you are going to underestimate the effect of population. And I think it's easy to basically look at both what is happening to the global order and how this global order is affected by demographic transformation by adapting some of the methods that we use in social sciences. One of the methods that we can tweak a little bit is just the use of social mobility tables that we use in social stratification studies. And essentially what you do here is just look at the rankings of countries over time. So how do countries rank in terms of their quintile position in 1970 versus 2010, and just follow whether there's a lot of movement around. And so this is 70, this is 2020 roughly. And so if a country stays put, they're going to be on the diagonal here. If a country moves up the rankings, they're going to be above. If they move down, they're going to be below. And to the extent that there's no reshuffling of the world order, if the world order remains the same, most countries are going to be on the diagonal. If there's a lot of mobility, you're going to have relatively few countries in the diagonal. And so this you can test with data. And that's one way to describe whether there's really a transformation in the world order at all, or a transformation in inequality. You can also try to see the role of population a little bit better in a way that includes age structure. How does population factor into shaping the changes in global inequality between countries? How are we doing on time? Want to see how much minutes?
5 minutes, we've got 20 more minutes.
Oh, perfect. Okay. So essentially what you want to do, you try to understand inequality between countries, right? And so basically at the minimum, the level of inequality between countries in the world and how it changes is going to depend on how the relative size of countries changing. Individual countries become bigger or smaller compared to the world, and how does their GDP per capita change relative. So these are the two components that we pay attention to. Now you can break this component, GDP per capita, and understand its component as well. And so GDP per capita really is a function of total GDP and the size of the population. So you can break it down like this, but you can actually, and that's a minor tweak. This is sort of a more elaborate version of this that I use in other papers. But if you break this down, instead of just using this sort of narrow form, you take GDP and reference to the adult population, and then multiply by the adult population over the entire population. Then you have two substantively important things. This is going to be labor productivity or something close to it. And then this is going to be age structure. So altogether, you are able to explain the change in inequality between countries as a function of three factors that are important, two of which are population related. One is population size, the other is age structure, and the other is productivity. And so this is basically the formulation that you can use in order to really do this decomposition, right? Now it's not for the economists in the room, just shoot me now. It has nothing to do with causality. It's really an accounting exercise, right? So the changes in inequality between countries over time are going to be driven by the effect of population size. This is the only thing that has been paid attention to, and that yielded the 2% that I talked about. Then productivity, and this is the new piece that I introduced, right? And you can do this as long as you have the data. And it turns out that we have the data. I can show you how to read the demographic decomposition table. It's pretty simple. You just have the input data here, the country's GDP per capita, population size, age structure, worker productivity as of 1970 for all of the countries in the world. And the same in 2020, you apply this formula here, and then you get sort of this substantive component here. How much of the change in inequality is driven by changes in population size, driven by changes in age structure, and driven by changes in productivity. And so that's one thing. The other thing that is really important is also the marginal side here. In addition to the substantive component here, you also have the regional component. How do individual countries contribute to that change? How do individual regions contribute to that change, right? And so you have actually the two pieces, and you can tell sort of a somewhat qualitative, but I think rich story about where the changes in inequality came from, substantively as well as regionally. And so as long as you have basic statistics on the country's GDP, per capita population, age structure, and so forth, you can run this analysis. And we tried data from the World Bank, and it was a little bit sparse, and the Penn World Table, we had a little bit more luck, except we lost a year. So instead of going all the way to 2020, we stopped here. But by and large, you have the data that you need, and you have data for about 92% of the world population. Right? It's not a full data set that is close. Okay. And so here I'm going to go through the main findings. First, the descriptive findings. Is there sort of a complete transformation in the world order? Is there a decline in inequality between countries? And then I'm going to look at the accounting results. So the first is the transformation in the world order. This is a little crowded, but I'm going to walk you through it. The first thing that we want to look at is the diagonal here. What percentage of countries are in the diagonal? And what is interesting here is that actually relatively few countries stayed in here, right? Only about half of the countries failed to move. There was actually a lot of movement in the global order. Not all of the countries stayed where they were in 1970. And that's, to me, was actually a little surprising. But this result is to be nuanced by two observations. The first is that if you look at the very top, countries at the very top and countries at the very bottom, there was relatively movement. The movement that happened was mostly within middle countries. And so that has an improvement. There was really no dramatic shift at the top or at the very bottom, right? If that's what you're interested in. The second thing is that if you look at rankings, quintiles are, just artificial lines that you draw to 20%, 40%, 60%, and so forth. Suppose a country was, really near the border and it moves up 1 or 2 position, it would appear to change quintile, and we would tend to overestimate the extent of movement. So we kind of took care of this. And so for all the countries that moved, we really listed the ones that made major jumps, meaning move by 30 nominal ranks or more, right? And so here you may see that, let me take an example here, for instance, you have 10 countries that appear to move up. But out of these 10 countries, only these did actually have real significant upward mobility. So this is actually the number that we should pay attention to. So I have both the nominal number, but the statistically meaningful list as well, right? So this, I would say, modest mobility is not trivial, but it's not, just a complete overhaul of the sort of the world order, right? What you can also see is that most of the movement stayed within near the diagonal. You had relatively few countries that made major jumps, right? That made jump more than 1 quintile. Now, if we take, and this is kind of straightforward, it was just reassuring to find what other people have found. If you now look at inequality in GDP between countries, you see this is a trend. There's been a steady decline over the last half century. Inequalities going down in GDP per capita. Countries are coming indeed together, as Friedman has suggested, as Firepol and Gosling have found. Inequality between countries is steadily declining. By any measure that you take here, by any measure of inequality, by any GDP measure, things are sort of narrowing, at least to some extent. And the narrowing is not trivial. It's about 44% decline from the levels that existed in 1970. Now, so that's the description. Not a total overhaul of the system, but nonetheless, some decline in inequality between countries. Now, why did this decline happen? and what has been the role of demography in the process. And this is where we are going to join into the story. Because the chart is a little crowded, I'm going to take you through this kind of one step at a time. So this is the overall decline in inequality, and we focus on each decade. And at the end of each decade, we look at the marginal decline or the marginal change, right? So from 1970 to 1980, inequality actually increased by this much. It declined here, declined. And so at each step, for each interval, we look at forces that push inequality up and forces that push inequality down. What are some of the processes that tended to drive inequality up versus driving down? And in this particular case, we want to pay attention to the role of the global north versus global south. I'm interested in what I call the distinction between a positive convergence versus negative convergence. Did the world converge because of inordinate progress among the south versus a slowdown or decline in the north? Right? So these are the results for the first, and I show the contribution of the global north, the south, and within the global south, what is the sub-region that made the greatest contribution, and what are the countries, what are the countries that made the greatest contribution? So the first decade here, what happens is that inequality increased, but in fact, countries in the global south actually pulled inequality in the direction of a decline. That's why you have a negative sign here. Right? So the global south influence or trends tended to reduce inequality, except they were overwhelmed by the fast progress in the north as well. And East Asia was sort of the dominant player, and in these countries you had China, and that underlined China because it's way ahead of the other, followed by Indonesia. Right? In the next two sections, it's basically the same pattern. Global South pushes inequality down, except sort of overall the effect of the global North. It really brought inequality down. East Asia was still the leading contributor. China far ahead of others, except it's followed by India this time. Same pattern basically here. Here, Global South is still sort of the main player. East Asia, as opposed to other countries, Latin America, the Caribbean, Sub-Saharan Africa, Middle East, and North Africa, is the dominant player, but you can see sort of the dominance is waning. And China here is almost closer to India in terms of their relative contributions as countries. And then at the end here, India overtakes China, and now South Asia is the dominant player as opposed to East Asia, right? But so the big story here is that there's been a convergence, and much of this convergence has been driven by progress in the global South. It's been a positive convergence, much of it driven by first East Asia and then South Asia later. Okay, if we summarize the full story overall, this is what we have here. The overall contribution of the global South was positive. China and India, the leading players, and the total decline being 0.32 units of in terms of inequality. So the first question was, okay, if we compare North versus South, what has been the leading contribution? Second question, if we can compare economic forces versus demographic forces, what have been the leading forces? Again, economic contribution would have to do with productivity and so forth, and demographic contribution is going to be population size and age structure. What is the leading force? All we have to do is essentially the findings from this equation here. How did this here, economic, how much did it contribute versus this, right? And so for each interval, I show this is the demographic contribution, and this is the economic contribution. Recall, inequality for this first interval has increased, mostly because of the inordinate progress in productivity among sort of richer countries. And here, demographic factors try to, more or less work to temper this growth of inequality, but it did not override this. So this is the contribution of demographic factors versus economic factors.
Could you just explain how to read these numbers? the net effect was roughly zero
Yes.
there, right?
Right.
And so do I take 128% and minus 28% and I get 100%? Is that the way it works?
Yes, exactly.
So the 128% we can think of as plus 28%?
Right, exactly.
Okay.
Right. If you didn't have the counter pull from demography, the inequality would have increased even more.
Okay.
It would have increased by 28% more than it had actually increased. So in the second wave, now the interesting thing is that both economic forces and demographic force worked in the same direction, bringing inequality down. Countries in the global south were actually improving in terms of economic productivity, at least closing the productivity gap, whereas the demographic transition also were working to reduce the
So
economic.
these add up to 100% here, and that means that 100% of the change, it's not the magnitude of the change, it's just of the change we observe. So it's the minus
Yeah.
a little bit.
Right.
That's the way it works.
Yeah.
Okay.
So they always add up to 100%, right? When you add them. The only switch is that if they work in opposite direction, you have a situation where you have negative numbers and numbers that are above 100. Right. So the next section, both actually work to do this. The next section is both work to reduce. Here, it was just basically demography played a minor role here, relatively big here, relatively big here, and sort of middling here. Right. Again, this is more than the 2% that we saw before, but it's actually also varies across over time. And so it would be interesting to see out of these demographic forces, how much of it comes from changes in population size and how much of it comes from transformation in age structure, right? So this is the totality of population size and age structure. And you want to break that down a little bit. And in the next step, you want to break it down by region as well. We have, this changes in age structure to tell a full story. But for now, let me just show you the story for comparing the contribution of age structure, the two demographic forces. How do they compare? Of the two, which was the bigger influence, and how do they operate? Again, you do the same looking at different age time intervals. For the first time intervals, both population size, P, and age structure really trended in a direction that worked to reduce inequality, global inequality between countries. And shifts in population size had the bigger influence in tempering inequality. But after that, systematically, you have age structure that had the most influential effect in reducing inequality. And in some cases, population was actually working in the opposite direction. So a study that wants to represent demography and that focuses on population size doesn't catch the entire story of how population is affecting that shift in global inequality between countries. And so basically that's the story we get. And so for this entire period from 1970 to 2010, age structure has been by far the dominant influence in terms of bringing transformation in age structure in bringing an inequality between countries down, and population size was relatively trivial. Again, the story is the same. Okay, so to bring that story to sort of not an end, because this is a work in progress. We still finishing this. I confirm what other people have already begun to show, but I would do more work on this, is that inequality, this shift of this sort of a shift in global world inequality to be mostly driven by inequality within countries as opposed to between countries, right? Now, what I want to do is actually begin to put numbers on it, basically have a trend line where I looked at shifting between the two components together to tell this story more fully. The second point that I think is part of my conclusion is that I want to suggest that demography matters. I have to confess that, while I'm not, you want to qualify the inevitability of demographic forces, in my view, too much of a tendency to downplay, even among demographers, the importance of demography. I think demography is a powerful force that is often underestimated when we are thinking about social change. So that's my thing here, but I still have to drill down a little bit deeper and think, yes, China and India were the dominant players, in the 80s, 90s, and so forth. But what about China made the greatest difference? Was it sort of transformation in China's productivity? Was it sort of transformation associated with fertility thing, or was it population size? To really make sure that we have the full story. So I want to drill a little bit deeper here, and then finally, Africa is emerging as an emerging epicenter of inequality. What I want to do, what we have left to do, if you recall, I talked about a century, 1970 to 2070. And so far, we've studied 1970 to 2020. And so I want to look at the next half century from now till the next 50 years. If you have projection on population size, projections on age structure, and if we can make tentative assumptions about trends in productivity, we can actually speculate about how inequality is going to change in the next 50 years, inequality between countries, and how much will demographic forces play into that trend. So this is what we have left to do. And with this, that's my end of my story.
For questions? Will?
Thank you. This is fascinating. I feel like I learned a lot even at this stage of the research. One quick question is I'm thinking about this. You're looking at GDP per capita, and am I thinking about that as just a measure of the economic output per capita, or am I thinking that as a measure of well-being? And if it's well-being, are you using market exchange rates or PPP, and does that even matter across this long span? Just that's one quick question. And second, as I'm thinking about age structure, again, thinking about well-being, my mind jumps to equivalence scales. So if I want to think about well-being, I'd be very curious to see how different this looks like if you were to actually use an equivalence scale adjusted measure of your sort of GDP per capita. So taking into account the fact that if you have sort of more children, they have sort of fewer economic needs as young people, and compared to a population that has sort of a lot more sort of working age adults. How does this change your measures of inequality? It's just that's sort of a larger philosophical question, whether you care about productivity or whether you're sort of caring about this well-being and consumption.
Yeah, the idea would be to get on well-being, because if you recall, the early difficulty we face with PPP measures is really data availability. The PPP for the World Bank data, they become available relatively later in that time frame, and they're also more sparse. And so we start with this as sort of a rough baseline, and then we're going to try to work our way into refining the story, both on the GDP thing and on some of the equivalency, and even the boundaries of the standard boundary that we choose here is 15 to 64, which is the adult population, whether we don't consider the details of employment and labor force participation and so forth. And so some of these details can be worked into the story gradually.
Could you say a little more about which part interests you most, and whether assuming measurement were no problem, are we more interested in the economic output side, or are we more interested in the well-being side?
I would be more interested in the well-being side. As a sociologist, that would be my ultimate end. And I actually wrote again, in sort of rare moments that I've tried to be provocative. I wrote, this story to me is a story about keeping up with the Joneses. And if you think about this, I think, and I wrote a piece in, was basically keeping up with the Kardashians, but the global Kardashians, right? The Kardashians are no longer, the neighbor next door, but it's really somebody globally that everybody can see and can emulate. And so the challenge in terms of thinking about inequality from a well-being standpoint is that the world is changing in a direction where comparisons are becoming more global and distressing. And so to the extent that countries are becoming less and less significant, that's one thing that I'm interested in. Yes, oh. Okay.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry, yeah, if you're thinking about well-being, I'm also thinking about how within country inequality relates to country inequality from a well-being perspective. So there's, thinking about how does GDP capture well-being, but there's also then, if you're comparing two countries with equal GDP, folks might experience less well-being in a country where there's more inequality. So whether or not you're thinking about looking at trends in between and within country inequality separately, or if there's a way to pull those together to get a more clear picture of trends in like a convergence of well-being.
Yeah, this is 2 steps beyond what I can do. I just wanted to be able to wrap my head around this very first piece, which is about productivity. Again, not being an economist, I've nonetheless been fascinated and interested in how the conversion between output and earnings into well-being and what factors into that equation. And this is something that I definitely would like to explore later, if the data would permit.
Hi, thank you. And I wanted to ask, in 2014, I think there's the Atlantic Commission on Global Health in 2035, and they talked about a grand convergence. And some of us called out the fact that the least developed countries are not on a path towards convergence in public health, and nor are they in fertility. And I'm thinking about the inland Sahel countries in particular, Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Chad. And could you say something about, could you say something about the case of the least developed countries, the fact that the UN, at least 4 years ago, their estimates were they would still be growing in population in 2100. What do you see happening there?
It's a great question. I think the limitation of this kind of analysis that looks at between country inequality is that it tells sort of a picture that is aggregate. Again, having India and China in the picture also would tend to miss out on many countries at the low end that are not converging at all. And that's why I try to break down the 2 waves, sort of Latin America and Asia, and then Africa. And in fact, even within Africa, I can see multiple sub-waves with South Africa, North Africa, and then the Sahel region being really on different space and trajectories as well. So that aggregate picture really misses out or blurs the trends in countries at the very bottom.
Magali?
Yes, thank you for the very thought-provoking presentation. I have maybe it's a naive question, but I'm wondering whether you could tell a completely reversed stories where the decline in inequality, which would be driven by increased wealth of the poorest countries, could be the force driving the fertility change and increasing productivity and population size.
Yeah, absolutely. Theoretically, you could tell this the story. I mean, what is the chicken and what is the egg? But at least in terms of the accounting that we do here, I think the piece that you break is the economic inequality piece. You could do something similar. If you could do something similar with the demographic inequality piece, then you can actually try to tease out the reverse story of demographic inequality being driven, demographic convergence being driven by economic convergence.
Yeah, but in that case, you say at the end that you would look at you do some simulation to see what's going to happen in the next 50 years by using projections of fertility trends and population size and so on. But you can't do that to predict inequality if inequality is the driving force behind this other components.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, my sense, and I would need to think about this a little bit more. But my sense is I'm going to have to think about sort of the assumption that I make into making these projections. You know, the assumption I make in terms of the, you know, what are the driving forces behind the trends in productivity? What are the driving forces? Or, you know, we have projections that exist already that I can hide behind. The ones that are about age and population size, you know, just use them. I was happy to see our colleague from the UN online very briefly that I can use. But as far as productivity, you know, I would have to make some very crude assumption, either things kind of staying the same or things changing at the same somewhat synchronously, etc. But I'll just have to start with very the least bold assumption and make them explicit. Yes.
Mark?
Thank you for a really interesting talk. I have a question that's explicitly outside what you've presented to us, but I would like to hear how you think about the politics of demography in this story. And so, for example, just you could take that many ways, but in a very crude way, like, does it matter what the political elites of these countries think they know about demography in terms of how this, whether and how it moves in one direction or another? How do you think about the politics of demography as part of this story, or is it just irrelevant?
Oh, no, it's totally irrelevant. There's the politics within academia, and then there's the politics within the world of policy, and then the politics in politics, right? Within academia, I think my politics is really to stake a bold claim about the relevance of demography. I think I'm all for sort of scientific modesty and caution, but caution is different from meekness. And I think I truly feel that demography is not, you know, there's nothing about determinism, but it's really a, you know, sort of force that's underplayed, and that has many layers. Some are delayed, lagged, you know, spillovers. That's the story. Now within policy, I have to think a little bit more, but within politics, and especially as I think about African countries, one, I don't have a whole story. I think about this as kind of a last call to join the world stage, right? You have country after country, you know, just rising to not the top, but at least converging to the world average. And so you have increasingly a subset of countries being left behind. As I was telling this story about, okay, Africa getting left behind, and then South Africa is sort of moving in, North Africa is moving east. So the ones that are going to leave, the ones that are going to be the last to leave would, in my view, may be stuck in a position where I think concerned about global inequality or inequality between countries may not be at the front anymore, because you have very few countries in that situation. Second of all, there's also going to be sort of this global middle class that is going to make countries relevant, and conversations within you know, across the world as less informative of what countries do. And so it's going to be incumbent upon countries to realize that within countries, there's tremendous amount of inequality, and they have to take on the responsibility to address the plight of the poor. Again, some of my work early on had to do with family size, and this research that's very fraught from a methodological standpoint, looking at the effect of family size on schooling and status attainment. But nonetheless, it concerns me to see this huge gap in birth rates between the top quintile of the economic distribution and the bottom quintile. And it's a gap that we find across all African countries, and it's not a trivial gap. Sometimes it's twice as many, sometimes 2.5 as many babies that need to be. And so in a competitive environment, I find it hard to see why that doesn't put some of the poorest family at a disadvantage, even though extended families of support and public policies can mitigate some of those inequality. It's a concern.
Okay, on that note, thank you so much.